To support our discussions with the world's leading thinkers, please see the video description or visit eism.eu/support. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to A Theory of Everything. I'm Luis Razo, the Executive Director of the European Institute of Science and Management. And today we're talking to Professor Fernando Cervantes, a distinguished historian at the University of Bristol in the UK, specializing in the intellectual and religious history of early modern Spain and Spanish America. His academic background includes prestigious fellowships at institutions such as the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies at UCLA. He has co-authored and edited several books, including The Devil in the New World, published by Yale University Press, and Angels, Demons, and the New World, published by Cambridge University Press. In 2005, Professor Cervantes was honored as the John Coffin Memorial Lecturer in the History of Ideas at the University of London, a testament to his important contribution to the history of ideas. The fact that this took place in the heart of the Anglo-intellectual sphere is meaningful and significant, at least in my view. His latest book is Conquistadores, A New History. It offers a new and important perspective on the Spanish conquest, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Professor Cervantes, thanks for taking the time to talk to us. Well, the name of this podcast, as I mentioned at the beginning, is A Theory of Everything, which is a term that comes from physics and refers to the search for an overarching theory that unifies quantum mechanics and general relativity. Normally, people don't associate history or even the social sciences with physics. But I've always argued that a theory of everything that doesn't include things like history and the social sciences is not a theory of everything. At best, it's a theory of some things, but it's not a theory of everything. So what we're after on this channel is something closer to a true theory of everything. And I think your book and your work represents a step in that direction to the extent that it highlights the importance of ideas and the importance of interpretation. So we argue that interpretation is critical, not only in physics, but in everything, in social sciences as well, of course. So interpretations and ideas, as you know, can lead to radically different empirical outcomes and to radically different societies, which is what I think makes your book so important. And that's something that I'd like to highlight in this exchange, and I hope I'm up to the task. So would you be nice enough to give listeners an overview of your book, The Conquistadores, A New History, and then we'll get into the details of why I think your interpretation matters?
Okay, yes, well, it's a book actually that I wouldn't have thought of writing had I not been urged by a literary agent who just rang me up out of the blue and told me that she wanted to publish a book on the Conquistadors because there was a big gap. And this was in 2015 when she rang me up and she said, there's this big anniversary coming up because the first expeditions to the mainland were in 1519, when Cortés reached Yucatan. They still thought that they were somewhere in the middle of some islands that were near Asia. So the realization that this was something completely new and that they really needed to think about it and that Europeans needed to integrate the new knowledge into their world does begin around that time, about 1519 onwards. So I was persuaded by this idea, and that's the reason why I began to research this book. The more I got into it, the more I realized that it had more or less, I had done all the research for it because I'd been thinking about these subjects for, 40 years or so. So I didn't really need to do a lot of research. I just needed to go back and rethink, reread primary sources and rethink the story. And the process of writing, and because it was the remit, that's what it was that I should write it for a general interested public rather than for academics, was extremely interesting. Because when you're in the business of writing academic books, you think you're at a certain level, and that writing for a general public, you need to water things down a bit. And that was completely the reverse in my experience. I think, writing for a general public is actually a lot more difficult. It doesn't mean that you're watering things down. It just means that you have to clarify all sorts of things. And that made me think a lot more of context, the importance of context and putting things in context. So that was the idea of this book, really, to contextualize this story that is so often not just misunderstood, but actually maligned by the general public because of the way in which the image of these early modern adventurers has been portrayed to us, as if they were less human than us. That's certainly the idea that is very prevalent. So that's what I wanted to challenge.
Excellent. And you lay out the book in 3 different sections. Tell us about the sections and some of the highlights, perhaps, of each section from your perspective.
Well, obviously, the beginning is discoveries. So the Europeans didn't have a clue where they were going. Columbus, as you know, was convinced that he was somewhere near India. That was the idea that he sold to the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabel. That's how they first very reluctantly decided to support him in a very half-hearted manner, because what they equipped him with was really very inadequate. And most people in Europe at the time knew that Columbus was a bit mad to think that he was going to reach India, because they knew about the size of the world. They knew that it was too far for any contemporary vessel to be able to reach that distance. And then Columbus arrived in the Caribbean and proved his mad theory that he was somewhere near India. Got back with quite a lot of evidence, because he brought back some indigenous peoples from the island that is now Santo Domingo, and the Dominican Republic, and they do look Asian. Now we know that the original inhabitants of America most probably came from Central Asia via the Strait of Bering. Some of them in South America might have come from the South Pacific. The origins obviously are Asian. So the way in which this, they're not called Indians for nothing. Columbus brought them back and called them Indians. So a lot of Europeans began to think, well, he must be wrong, because we know about the size of the world. These calculations had been done by, as far back as the Greeks and the Egyptians. Ptolemy had calculated the size of the world pretty well. So most scientific minds at the time were pretty sure that he was wrong. But they were faced with this empirical evidence that he was right. And Columbus was adamant that he was somewhere near Asia, that he had proved that the world was smaller than scientists thought. And that created quite a lot of debate at the time. And that's from the history of ideas, that's extremely interesting to see how they were incorporating all this new evidence into what they knew. And of course, that was not just scientific knowledge, but as you say, with your interest in the theory of everything, they had a much more all-encompassing understanding of reality than we do nowadays. Nowadays, we have a more fragmented approach to reality. But in those days, things needed to fit in. So there were lots of very interesting debates going on that very often historians lose sight of. I'm not sure. All you need to remember is Cole Porter's song. The famous, they all laughed at Christopher Columbus when he said the world was round. I'm not sure if you remember that song. But that's
no,
what
I don't remember.
think.
Sorry.
Well, Cole Porter, they all laughed at Christopher Columbus when he said the world was round. And but that's what a lot of people think. Columbus was the forward-looking visionary that convinced people that the world was round, because primitive people at that time just assumed that it was flat. You ask anyone, and the number of people that still believe that is complete nonsense, of course, but they still believe that. Now, the debates were much more sophisticated and interesting. So that the first part is really try to establish that. The second part of the conquests is just, the big adventures, because they are really extremely interesting stories in their own right. To retrace the steps of Cortés conquering Mexico and the steps of Pizarro conquering Peru, and there are all sorts of other adventures going on at the time. Lots of epics, histories and chronicles and debates and were published at the time, letters. Also, there's a wealth of information that you can use to reconstruct these extremely impressive adventures. Regardless of what you think about what they did. Of course, they committed many atrocities, and in the book, I'm not out to whitewash or hide the atrocities. They're all there, but that doesn't mean that we cannot, as historians, try to understand the mentality, the motivations, what drove them to do these things, which were really quite impressive feats. Incredibly difficult things to achieve with the resources that they had available. So the amount of energy that went in there, what were their convictions, what drove them, is very, very important. Then, of course, when the news began to get back to Europe about precisely the atrocities, especially when Charles V found out that Atahualpa, the emperor of the Incas, had not only been betrayed, but then murdered by Pizarro and his followers after a trial that was a complete parody of what a European trial should be. He was furious, and he said, he said the most shameful thing is that this was carried out in the name of justice. What kind of justice is this? Then he called all the jurists and theologians in Salamanca to debate the issue. And one of the greatest minds of the time, the famous Dominican professor in Salamanca, Francisco de Vitoria, he gave a devastating set of lectures where he completely deprived the Spanish crown of any argument to justify the conquest or their presence in America. So imagine the crisis that created. So the final section, which is called desencanto, disillusionment, when people began to question whether these things could be justified or not, and the way in which the momentum was lost, that is the final part of it. But I tried to reassess at the end what the legacy of these early adventurers was, because they actually did set up some very important foundations for what came later, which is also in a process of being reconsidered and rethought, because we all grew up. I'm not sure if you obviously didn't go to school in Mexico, but I remember the history classes at school in Mexico, where the colonial period, as it's known, which is an age of 300 years of slavery and exploitation, and then you have the insurgency, where Latin American countries at last break away from the shackles of obscurantism and begin to build their republics, their liberal republics, which are now what is prevalent. And they all say that it's taken them so long to build proper institutions, precisely because of the horrible 300 years that they had when they were all slaves. And most historians who study the so-called colonial period now are reluctant to call it colonial in the traditional sense of the word, of these colonies that were there to be exploited for the purpose of for the benefit of the center, because for at least 200 years it was precisely the reverse. They were given a lot of autonomy. Indigenous rights were respected. Indigenous legislation had its place. There were lots of local. The role of the monarchy was precisely to defend this, what are known as, in Spanish, the word is fuero, which is very difficult to translate into English because it's some kind of local right or local privilege, but it's rooted in historical, in the way in which these regions have a particular way of doing things that needs to be respected. And that was intrinsic to the way in which the viceregal period was organized. So to begin to understand that leads you to the conclusion that what we see nowadays, when people lament the marginalization, the oppression of indigenous communities, and they want to trace it back to the colonial period, and especially to the conquest. And what you find is that the real marginalization happened in the 19th century when liberal reforms obliterated all this Hispanic legislative inheritance, where indigenous communities could claim not just to have rights, but to be able to appeal to the real sources of authority directly to the monarchs, and the monarchs were very, very keen to defend those privileges. So we're getting a very, very different picture now of the so-called colonial period, and I think it's in desperate need of reassessment.
Okay, well, the interpretation that you've just set out, of course, goes contrary to the narrative that has been promoted probably for the, I don't know, as far as I know, for the past 2 or 3 or 4, maybe 400 years. And I suppose my question is, you're trying to bring the positive aspects of the Spanish conquest of the Americas to light. How would you respond to somebody who says, what's the difference between trying to bring out the positives of these atrocities and trying to say that somebody who, let's say a serial killer in the US, he murdered, 50 children, but he also was a Boy Scout and he also did community service. What's the difference here?
Well, yes, of course, to set out to whitewash is not honest. And I would emphatically say that that's not the purpose of my book. There are no atrocities hidden in the book. They're all recounted in great detail, and I'm certainly not trying to justify what they did. But you could also, I could turn the question around and say a serial killer who is demonized and just obliterated as some kind of monster, doesn't that contain a blind spot? Because you don't have serial killers coming out of nowhere. There's always a context for these things. As a historian, I always want to understand what drove somebody to become a serial killer. That's not to justify their actions, but I want to know what the circumstances are that led them into that kind of action, and how the society around it, to a certain extent, must be responsible for it. Because demonizing is a very easy way out. Very easy way out. We're seeing it all over the place here with the whole crisis of abuse and especially child abuse that is going on. It's very, very easy to demonize the perpetrators, to turn them into horrible monsters so that you justify your own position. But these people exist in a context, don't they? So wouldn't it be much healthier to say, why is our society, what is wrong with our society that these people actually exist? What could we do? I mean, abusers need the support of the society as much as the abused. And the abused themselves always say that, because in, 90% of cases or more, you do find out that the abusers were themselves victims of abuse. So if society doesn't, with honesty, try to understand what causes those things, there'll be no progress. We won't be able to advance, and we will create more prejudice. So I think it's healthier to say, right, let's see what happened here. What drove these people? Were they really the monsters that have been painted to us? Because that's another thing with the conquistadors. There's this very long tradition of what is known as the Black Legend. I'm not sure if I'm jumping the gun here, because you might want to bring that discussion to later
please
on.
Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
Well, as you know, the first critics of the conquistadors were conquistadors themselves. You know, Cortés had a bunch of enemies who had participated in the conquest, but then started painting a very, very dark picture of everything he did, because they were very disillusioned with what he had done. At the same time, there were lots of people who had seen the atrocities and reported them to the Spanish crown. And in the style of the time, the way in which most people did this was by writing what were known as diatribes. You know, that was an accepted rhetorical device. You would write a very exaggerated piece of rhetoric in order to shock. You know, the aim was to provoke a shock in order to implement the needed reforms. The most famous example of this was, of course, the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who wrote very famous diatribes. One of them is called the Brevísima Relación, the most brief account de la destrucción de las Indias, of the destruction of the Indies. I mean, that says it all, doesn't it? And when you read it, you see that you're reading a piece of rhetoric, because he never mentions names. He mentions innocent indigenous peoples who lived in some kind of pre-lapsarian idyll where they were happily living together and not doing anything wrong. They didn't even need to wear clothes because they were so innocent. They had no desire for gold. And then these rapacious Spaniards arrived and killed them all. Well, that is obviously not the case. Las Casas himself participated in the conquest of Cuba, got an encomienda himself. It took quite a long time for him to begin to realize that wasn't justified, and then he had a conversion and he changed and eventually became a Dominican and spent the rest of his life writing against the abuses of the so-called encomenderos, people who were exploiting indigenous peoples for, you know, to work in the mines and to work for them. It was a kind of de facto slavery, as Las Casas understood it. But all these polemics did have an effect. I mean, you have first of all, the laws of Burgos in 1512, and then eventually the new laws. You also have the condemnation by jurists and theologians at Salamanca. So obviously something, you know, the Spaniards themselves back in Europe were thinking seriously about these issues. But what happened was that, as you know, Spain at that time was the greatest power in Europe. There was a big revolt in the Netherlands, which was suppressed during the reign of Philip II. Philip II himself sent a big armada to England because he wanted to stop Elizabeth doing everything that he knew Elizabeth quite well, because he had been married to Mary Tudor in the 1550s, and they were actually good friends. They had discussed all sorts of things together. So he couldn't understand why she was implementing Calvinist policies in England at the time, and really couldn't understand why the unity of Christendom had been so badly broken. So the idea of sending the armada was, you know, to bring her back to her senses. You know, she was Philip was going to, as it were, go back to those years when he was married to Mary Tudor. That was his vision. But obviously Elizabeth took it very differently. The Dutch rebels took it very differently, and they started attacking Philip as some kind of horrible individual, depraved. William of Orange in the Netherlands wrote his famous apology, which was published in 1580, shortly after the first revolt of the Netherlands, where he painted an atrocious image of Philip. You know, as he had murdered his son and his wife. He had committed incest, adultery everywhere. He was totally depraved. He was a psychopath. All sorts of things that now, all the modern biographers of Philip have established that these are obviously fabrications. But that image came down. It sank in very, very deeply into the European consciousness. All you have to do is, if you're interested in opera, just listen to Verdi's famous opera, Don Carlos. Don Carlos is the son of Philip II, and Philip II there appears as a complete psychopath in charge of the Inquisition. And of course, all this image of the Inquisition as a bunch of psychopaths burning heretics left, right, and center comes from that time as well. The interesting thing is that nobody seemed to contradict it at the time, certainly not in England and Holland. But the interesting thing is that nobody in Spain bothered to contradict it either.
May I pause there quickly? That's
sure.
a remarkable thing to me. I've been living in Spain now for about 15 years, and one of the most surprising things that I found here was that Spaniards as a whole, and I think most of the people I talk to agree with this, suffer from very low self-esteem as a culture, as a nation.
Yeah.
So it seems that there are still vestiges of this Black legend propaganda, even to the present day. And it's always been surprising to me. Have you found this to be also the case?
Yes, and it starts quite early on, because you see, when the propaganda, when the apology of William the Silent began to be used, and of course William the Silent could use all the information that was being produced by Spaniards at the time. So he could just say, look, I'm not making these things up. It's straight from the horse's mouth, as they say. This ex-conquistador is telling us what happened. It's atrocious. He was using the writings of Las Casas in order to create the Black Legend. Las Casas would have been extremely upset if he had known what these diatribes, how they were going to turn the tables around, because Las Casas was a great defender of the Spanish monarchy. His argument was always that it was the role of the king to stop these abuses. That the only reason why the Spaniards were in the New World was to spread the gospel, and that was the only thing that that king should promote at the time. By the middle of the 16th century, this idea had really sunk into the consciousness of certainly Philip II and his advisors. They implemented quite a lot of regulations in order to stop private initiatives. The way in which these early expeditions were set out were all private ventures, just as they had been done before. They didn't realize the enormity of the enterprise that they would end up having to cope with. So from the middle of the century, certainly from 1542, the promulgation of the new laws, there is legislation to stop the kind of conquests that had led to the abuses that they had seen, especially in the case of Peru under Pizarro. Most expeditions were authorized if they took with them a substantial number of religious, especially mendicant friars, Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians, Mercedarians, who would ensure that the indigenous peoples were treated fairly. So there's a very strong sense that there is a real attempt being made to make sure that justice happens in the New World. By the time that Philip II dies in 1598, he had gone through a period of severe depression, because especially after the failure of the Armada, and had stopped all. In the 1580s, there was still the idea that the next step was China. And there were lots of Franciscans and Jesuits in China sending letters. The evidence is all there, that the Chinese would have been willing for the Spaniards to arrive and take over at that time. Franciscans and Jesuits were getting ready for it. They were trying to convince Philip, and Philip said, no, I've had enough of this. Enough this is not leading anywhere. There were lots of criticisms inside Spain that the New World had been a real burden, and that had brought down, there was a lot of inflation at the time, a lot of migration, economic crisis, shortages, famines, a succession of bankruptcies. So in the early 17th century, you have a group of people trying to work out and explain to themselves what had gone wrong. And they begin to write about the ills of the Spanish monarchy. They're called the so-called arbitristas. It's a genre of people who were explaining what had gone wrong. Most of them would blame the burdens of empire and how they needed to stop all that because it had been too much for the Spanish monarchy. So this kind of introspective literature led to a realization that obviously the empire was a problem, and they didn't bother to combat the Black Legend theories. There was no, if there were any objections to what William the Silent was saying and all these other propagandists, they haven't survived. Certainly, I haven't come across any Spanish author who wrote in defense of empire or imperial Spain or anything like that. It begins to happen again, really, in the 18th century. But that's a different story because, as you know, the last of the Habsburg monarchs, Charles II, Carlos II, who died very neatly in 1700, did not have an heir. So there was a succession crisis. There was a war, the famous War of the Spanish Succession, which went on for nearly 15 years. It eventually resolved in 1714. A Bourbon took over, named Philip V, who happened to be the nephew of Louis XIV, the famous Sun King, L'État c'est moi, I am the state, with a completely different understanding of the state, much more top-down. So it was and they began to implement the so-called Bourbon reforms. Those reforms led to the complete exclusion of the autonomies, as they are now called. So Catalonia was incorporated into the Crown of Castile. There was a very centralized system of government. All the privileges and rights were abolished. Castilian became the official language. Nobody encouraged people to speak Catalan or anything like that. So all these anxieties and complaints that we see in Catalonia right now, that's where they have their root in the early 18th century. They don't really have much prehistory to that. Of course, there was a Catalonian revolt in 1640. That's because when at that time the Count Duke of Olivares had initiated the Union of Arms in order to build up the strength of the monarchy again, because it had, they were very conscious of the decline of Spain, and he tried to bring back the Spanish reputation in Europe by a so-called Union of Arms, and that obviously was a great irritant to the Catalans, who rebelled. But as soon as they rebelled, they realized that they were much better under the Castilian crown than under the French crown. So the rebellion went back to normal, and the Spanish crown learnt its lesson that they better not interfere too much with Catalonian rights and privileges. The important thing was to let regional autonomy thrive. But the Bourbons had a completely different understanding. So that's when the real problems begin. And then in the early 19th century, after the Napoleonic invasion and the Wars of Independence, which coincided with the Wars of Independence across the whole of Spanish America, it's exactly the same rhetoric that you get. The Spaniards begin to talk about 300 years of foreign oppression, because they could point to first the Habsburgs and then the Bourbons, foreign dynasties that had wrecked the nation, and now they needed to emerge from that. So in the early 19th century, you have exactly the same rhetoric, which swallows the theory or the idea of the Black Legend completely. And that's where that sense of inferiority, that sense of that complex, really, that Spain somehow had lagged behind the rest of Europe and needed to catch up with the rest of Europe, became so ingrained. It is, of course, true in technological terms. There's no doubt that Spain lagged way behind England, France, and Holland, and there was no industrial revolution. There was no scientific curiosity either. They were all falling back into the old-fashioned Aristotelianism, all sorts of theories about progress in Europe being rooted in the principles of the French Revolution, which were anti-clerical, therefore anti-Catholic. These incredibly balmy ideas that were still being circulated at the time of the Civil War, that all the ills of Europe could be traced to some kind of Judeo-Masonic conspiracy to destroy Christendom and all that sort of thing. That became very ingrained in the Spanish psyche. And you find it also in Latin America, especially among the conservative wing of Spanish America. They also see that as the big cause of their ills. So if you adopt that position, obviously you're going to be, of course we need to catch up, but we got to do it in a different way. And nobody thought in terms of, let's understand, exactly what was going on. Let's see what happened in the 17th and 18th centuries. And, 16th, 17th, and 18th century, very, very important period. But most historiography looked at it as a period of backwardness, obscurantism. There was nothing worth studying there. It was just decline.
Very interesting. That's precisely why I argue that your book is such an important move in the right direction. And you talk about context. It seems that in the contemporary context of the culture wars between progressives and conservatives and the anti-colonial movement, and then there's the opposite of the Black Legend is the Yellow Legend or something like that. It seems to me that people, extremes on the left and the right, somehow overlook the fact that, or they see Western civilization as an oversimplified set of ideas, when in reality it comprises very diverse strains, like the Catholic versus the Protestant versus the non-theistic traditions, and each contributes a different set of ideas and a different interpretation of reality. And I think this is something that is sorely missed in the contemporary debates and dialogue. The difference between these, for example, Hispanic versus Anglo ideas. I know you end up with your book on highlighting some of the differences that the societies and the created in Latin America, how they're different in terms of the modern quest for ever increasing economic returns and economic gains, and the impact of this form of thought versus other alternatives. Can you elaborate on this and the role that it plays in your book?
Yes, well, this is something that just emerged as I was trying to conclude the book. After explaining all these debates and the context of the debates and how they were trying to move the question of justice forward, and how political authority was understood at the time, which was a very decentralized, and there were no references to anything that we might call the nation state as the unit of analysis. And we always fall back into that trap. We tend to think of Spain, for example, when the Mexican president and López Obrador in 1521 demanded an apology from the King of Spain for the conquest, that the King of Spain should apologize for the conquest. He got a very interesting reply from the king, who it was not the king himself, but one of his advisors said, well, Spain did not conquer Mexico. It was a set of Castilians. It was not, Spain didn't exist at the time as a nation state. So it was a very different concept. But not many people think about that. We tend to fall back into the trap of thinking that the nation state, even when it didn't exist, is something that will inevitably emerge out of the circumstances. But it could have gone a completely different way. Spanish America, if Napoleon hadn't invaded Spain and things had carried on in the 19th century, they might have developed into, I don't know, a set of independent kingdoms rather than republics, with autonomous regions rather than centralized states with an army and a standing army and a capital and a bureaucracy to rule. It might have carried on in a very decentralized way. Why can't we think in trying to contextualize those things, which is exactly how Spanish America was ruled in the 17th century and the first half of the 18th century. And it was extremely prosperous. All you have to do is look at the testimonies of people who visited Spanish America. The most famous example is Alexander von Humboldt, who compared Mexico City and Peru very, very favorably to Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, saying that this was the real center of Western civilization was down there. These were cities graced with palaces worthy of Rome and Naples, and lots of very, very interesting individuals writing groundbreaking books, not only literary and theological, but also scientific. Great prosperity, wealth, and the way in which it was distributed, the way in which all the indigenous communities had their place, and they could defend their rights and privileges. Why hasn't anybody noticed that? So in the conclusion, I said, it would be a very good moment to rethink this period in order to show us where the modern world actually has gone wrong. You see, because up until recently, that was the way forward, wasn't it? Capitalism was a good thing because it had brought about a lot of wealth, unprecedented amounts of wealth. Well, now we're beginning to realize that, of course, there is more wealth, but there's much more unjust distribution of that wealth. It's a wealth that's produced an enormous amount of multi-billionaires and a huge amount of deprived people all over the place.
I would add to that it also comes at a potentially much more significant price, in the sense that we're now battling with the whole environmental crisis on the one hand, and in terms of artificial intelligence, we don't know how to control that. And there's some really respected thinkers across the political spectrum who are genuinely worried about the destructive potential of artificial intelligence, and we don't have a way of managing this. So I think this question goes really, really deep.
Yeah, and I think it has to do with the way in which we have given pride of place to empirical ways of understanding reality, as if the empirical scientific method is the only way to achieve the truth. I think you started by saying, when you were trying to explain the theory of everything, one point you made was that if you're just trying to combine quantum mechanics and relativity, or whatever it is that physicists are trying to do now, that is a very interesting way forward. But I think a lot of the physicists I know I've had conversations with, if they're interested in philosophy or history, they're the first ones to admit that the really interesting scientific discoveries almost invariably happen when you least expect them. You know,
Yeah.
is when you're in the middle of an experiment and you're expecting something and something else happens. And you think, well, that must be wrong. And then you do the experiment again and it happens again. And it doesn't really fit the to use a word that I don't like, but sort of the discourse or the intellectual tradition that physicists are working in, because you cannot have science without some kind of method of thinking, which comes from a tradition, comes from a language. And it's that causes the scientific revolutions. You know, it's when you begin to adapt the way of thinking in order to be able to incorporate those discoveries that then that progress is made. So the old theory that you know, it was a very, very logical sequence of progressive steps, you know, that somebody discovered something and then you stood on that and then you discovered something else, and it was a very logical sequence. Most historians of science now dispute that and say it's much more interesting, because it really you're working within a paradigm, and when an experiment breaks the paradigm, you have to create a new paradigm. So it's a method of thinking. So a really good scientist won't be able to understand his or her own position without some kind of philosophy and historical tradition.
Yeah.
An understanding of where they are in that historical process. We did not create the language we speak in. You know, we learned it. It's not something that we invented. We can't claim empirical scientific understanding of how language works. You know, it's something that is completely outside our control. Well, not completely outside our control, but we've got to acknowledge the very, very real limitations that we have when we're speaking a certain language. You know, so we have to adhere to the rules that we didn't invent, otherwise we wouldn't be able to communicate. And it's the same with science. So that whole tradition of giving pride of place to empirical scientific knowledge as if it was the only way to establish the truth there is a huge blind spot there as well. You know, it's not the only way of understanding reality. You have to put it in some kind of context, and you have to acknowledge that the understanding that physicists have now might be very limited in some ways, and that in 200 years' time they might look back and say, look, that's what they thought at that time, but now we know better. You know, things are constantly changing. So that's what I mean by the need to contextualize, and that's where the role of the historian is so important. You know, we are history. I regard history as a very, very important way into understanding where we are and where we've got things wrong, where we might improve things in the future. So this idea of contextualizing the 16th and 17th centuries in the Hispanic world, obviously there were all sorts of things that played against technological progress, but there are all sorts of other things that made you know, the environmental impact of those organizations much more beneficial to nature. I mean, we would not have had an environmental crisis if we had carried on with that pre-technological way of organizing the world. So.
Well, your point is well taken. However, if it's not empirical results that is ultimately judging our ideas, what option is there?
No, I wouldn't want to appear as somebody who's against the empirical method and the scientific method. I'm just saying that to give it pride of place as the most important way of approaching reality will skew our perception of reality in a very serious way, and it's obvious that certainly has happened since the time of the Enlightenment. I'm not an enemy of the Enlightenment. I think it had lots of incredibly good things, and obviously it would be absurd to throw them out of the window. I'm all in favor of separation of church and state, of the division of powers, the understanding of modern political organizations. I think are a lot more interesting than monarchical organizations in the way we had them before. But to say that is the only, to swallow the whole story of the Enlightenment, that you needed to break away from everything that had done before, is
that's a mistake. That's a mistake, definitely.
It's not just a mistake. It's almost suicidal, isn't it? Because
sure.
You're cutting away more than 90% of your inheritance.
Sure. In fact, one of the arguments that I'd like to put forward to people is the idea that the School of Salamanca, which had a number of really novel and interesting ideas in many branches of philosophy and economics as well, had it been heeded by, for example, Adam Smith and his mistaken notion of the objective value of labor, might have avoided not only our current predicament, but things like the Marxist revolution, because Karl Marx himself used the labor theory of value, the objective labor theory of value, to found Marxism. And of course, Marxism has gone on to cause, hundreds of millions of deaths. The idea being that the value of an object depends on the amount of work it takes to make that object.
Yeah.
Whereas the School of Salamanca had been clear that the value of an object depends on context, which is precisely what you've been arguing, through your book and through this conversation. Context makes everything, and it's the value that an individual gives to something in a particular context is the governing principle of economics. So I think this is the mistake that the Northern European or Protestant movement, the chief mistake that it has made in moving away from the idea that value is subjective in terms of I value things according to the context. This seems to be like the central idea. And it's something that I was begging or hoping that it was something that you would take up in your book. You didn't get that far, but you certainly laid the ground for it. And this idea that how do we get there? How do we balance the current dominant Anglo-Protestant perspective of technology and efficiency and economic growth? How do we balance that with an alternative? Do you have any ideas or what do you think of that?
I feel, to be honest with you, quite out of my depth with proposing solutions. I think the suggestions I made in the book is that we are at the moment going through a stage which should be a lot more receptive to going back to heed some of the things that the School of Salamanca was trying to propose in the 16th century. They were themselves, of course, the School of Salamanca was notorious in Europe for doing their homework very thoroughly with the medieval tradition. Whereas the rest of the European universities were kind of moving forward towards Renaissance way of thinking and adopting Cartesianism in particular in the theory of knowledge. That Descartes had actually said that in order to know something, you really needed to start from scratch, get rid of all your prejudices and preconceptions, and start from scratch, clear and distinct ideas. Well, anyone in Spain at the time, and if you read the works of Calderón de la Barca or even Cervantes in Don Quixote, they're constantly pointing the finger at the complete illusion that creates. You create a world of illusion where the boundary between illusion and reality becomes very blurred, because all you need to do is to remind Descartes that he was writing in French or Latin. You know, if you want clear and distinct ideas without any preconceptions, you would need to invent a completely new geometrical language. You wouldn't be able to use Latin or French. So there's a big blind spot there with inheritance, with context, with all that sort of thing, which now philosophers are really beginning to come to grips with. I mean, if you talk to any, even hardline analytical philosophers working in the tradition of, I'm not sure if there are any logical positivists left around, but there might be a few, but they're certainly very proud of that, you know, the empirical tradition. Even if you talk to them, I think most of them have assimilated Wittgenstein's deep criticism of the possibility of a private language. You know, he said there's no such, there cannot be a private language because we learn through imitation. We're essentially social animals. This idea of an autonomous individual self is the most bizarre myth in the history of ideas. I don't know why it became so persuasive, but it's certainly a lot of people are beginning to realize that we're essentially social beings working within cultural boundaries that we haven't created, and that we have to respect all that. We have to integrate ourselves not only with our culture but also with our environment. So that more holistic approach to reality, to our understanding of reality, is fundamental right now. If we're going to avoid a catastrophe, you know, destroy the world as we know it and make human life impossible on this planet, we really need to take steps towards that. And we can actually look back and see how things were done. Not just, I mean, we can keep all the technology, but I think what we need to do is to learn how to use it for the benefit of the environment. And we can only do that by adopting a much more organicist rather than a mechanistic approach. That's how I would put it. But as I say, really out of my depth is not. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a philosopher. So I can only look back and explain what was going on then and see if there are any lessons can be learned from our past.
Well, fantastic. Thank you very much for that, for sharing that. Let me ask you, or use the last moments that we have here. You've been generous enough to give us an hour. I know that you have done quite a bit of work on angels and demons, and this seems to be like as far as possibly removed from physics, but we have, interestingly enough, to tie it into what we've been talking about before about solutions and possible ways forward. We've been working with a team of leading academics and from around the world, in Europe and US and Israel, on the connections between physics and decision theory. And one of the guiding principles, or two of the guiding principles that we're using in a very empirical way, are attraction and repulsion. So we're always attracted toward some things and away from other things. And so this concept of angels and demons has that incorporated into the ideas. No, angels are things that are attractive and demons are the opposite. So would you be nice enough to share a little bit about your work on angels and demons and what's the next step for you in this regard?
Well, the reason why I got into that is actually not an original interest in the idea of angels and demons. What I was interested in when I started doing my doctoral work was the process of secularization. You know, how did a society that was where it would have been completely irrational to deny the existence of God become a society where the non-existence of God is taken for granted by most people, and if it isn't, then it's not something that should be relevant to the way you lead your life. Certainly not to politics, and you really keep it completely separate. So I was very interested in how that transition had happened, because it is very recent, and it is actually very odd if you think about human experience. You know, the idea of belief in a transcendent being that created the universe, but also a set of beings that are in between the material and the spiritual, with all sorts of gradations, was the default position for most of our intellectual DNA. I mean, it's something that is there, and we still tend to react. You know, people who claim not to believe in anything are quite happy to read the horoscopes and think of the influence of the stars, or so it's something that is there. So that was the idea that I had, to try to establish how the context emerged for that kind of thing to become possible. And I discussed it with my supervisor in Cambridge in those days. It was the early 80s, and he just said, look, you need to find a serious vein of information that will yield results. You can't just do sit down and think about these things through. You have to find an archive that will provide the evidence for this. So at the time I was reading a very influential book called Religion and the Decline of Magic by the legendary Oxford historian Keith Thomas. And I thought, why don't I do something similar with Mexican archives? So I went, with that idea, I went into the archives of the Inquisition in Mexico, which are very, very rich, and found these recurring, that the devil was assumed to be at work in any heterodox practice, or anything that was outside nature, or anything that couldn't be explained was always referred to the devil. So that's why I ended up writing that book, The Devil in the New World. So it was a history of ideas. And then, I became well known for being an expert on that particular subject. So I supervised a few doctoral theses, and one of my brightest students at the time decided, you've only done one side of the coin. What about angels? Angels are really much more interesting. And it's not true that in the literature it's the devil who has the best tunes. I mean, he's the one who's the most folkloric. Angels, you don't really think of angels as interesting things at all. They are very ethereal. But in medieval cosmology, they are incredibly interesting. They're the ones that kind of structure the universe in a particular way, because there are 9 hierarchies of them. And most medieval theologians were constantly thinking about the activities of each one of the hierarchies of angels in relation to the Trinity, the relationship of the three persons of the Trinity. So if you read someone like Bonaventure, for instance, it's a fascinating architectural understanding of how the whole universe works. That should interest any physicist trying to work out. You hear physicists now talking about parallel universes, and the way in which the whole universe seems to be much more alive than we thought. It's not just inert matter there, but the further you go into the atoms, the more life and the more activity you find in them. So obviously these medieval thinkers were not as completely misguided as we used to think. That we have not just emerged from an age of ignorance into an age of rationality. We might have gone from an age of extremely interesting rationality in the Middle Ages to an age of great simplification in our understanding of reality, and now we seem to be going back to a more organic conception of the world. So a rational interest in these things can be very enriching. That would be my position.
Fantastic,
Professor. I certainly wouldn't be in favor of credulity, superstition. All those things are terrible. But the medievals were just as enemies of those things as we are. You read the really interesting medieval thinkers. They were all great enemies of superstition, superficiality. They were great thinkers. So, and I think we've lost sight of that tradition in a way that has harmed the way in which we understand things nowadays.
Yeah, very true. Not only were they great thinkers, I think today there's an overestimation of how much we think we really know, and there's a lot of superstition that we're still living with, I would argue.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
Professor, you've been very generous with your time today. Thank you so much. We've been talking about your book, Conquistadores, A New History. I highly recommend listeners to pick it up and take a listen, read it. It's a very good book, important book in the history of ideas. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you.